not used to conferences. I'm not academic, I'm not a theologian, but I'm ready to share something of our experience in Taizé. And I've taken this title, Pilgrims of Trust, the adventure of Taizé and young people, because that has become our life very much in Taizé, this adventure, this welcoming of young people. And I wanted to break my talk down into 3 sections. First of all, to speak a little bit about the historical background of Taizé, taking a word from our rule, never stand still. And then secondly, more in the context of what we're sharing in the conference, to speak about our links with Central and Eastern Europe, to speak about the journeys that our brothers made to the East. And then finally, third section, to speak about the meetings in Taizé and elsewhere, also in this context. Those of you who've been to Taizé, you'll know that there's always something new that wasn't there the last time that you came. There's a new building, or there's a garden, or there's a slight change in the church. What is true for the youth meetings, it's even more true for the house of the brothers. This is a picture of our kitchen when I left. Our house seems to be a perpetual building site. Rooms are constructed and reconstructed. Stairways appear where there were none before, and suddenly a door appears that had disappeared years before. Nothing is static. And this can be a little bit disconcerting, because everyone seeks stability in one way or another in their lives. But this also reveals surely something about the character of our community and of our founder, Brother Roger. The idea of nothing being fixed, of being open to change, of being ready to adapt to the conditions and needs of the time, of being ready to accept the differences of others. Brother Roger, in the 1960s, he spoke about the dynamic of the provisional. And later, he would quote one of the church fathers, Gregory of Nyssa, by saying we go from one beginning to another. Brother Roger didn't have a program, and that was his strength. In many ways, he started with nothing, and he didn't know really how things would continue. At the beginning, he imagined a life in community of material goods, and living a celibate lifestyle. But then he saw the need of accepting obedience and lifelong vows. And the community grew, but went forward without a real program. Brother Roger let himself be led, rather than live from preconceived ideas. One of our older brothers spoke at our annual Brothers' Council some years ago and said that the community, the biggest steps forward came in the years 1966 to 68. In 1962, the community was already well known, and a new church building, larger than the village church that was used before, called the Church of Reconciliation, had been inaugurated. Many church leaders came to take part in that. From the Moscow Patriarchate, there was Father Vsevolod Stiller, Father Vladimir Kotlyarov. You You also see on the photo there Metropolitan Anthony Bloom. They came to this opening. Metropolitan Nicodemus Rotov later blessed the icon of the Vladimir Mother of God in the church of Taizé. And then there was also the fact that two brothers had taken part as observers in the Second Vatican Council. They'd become very well known at the council. Everyone knew who they were. And perhaps it would have been enough to stop with that and be satisfied, to be recognised by the Protestant and Anglican churches from which the brothers came, to have good contact with the Orthodox churches, and to rejoice over the surprising way in which the Catholic Church had welcomed their participation in the council. After 1965, when the council finished, Brother Roger went through a difficult time. But like for many creative people, it's as if that difficult period prepared something that was still to come. The brother recalled how in 1966, Brother Roger began to speak about young people, saying that there would soon be great changes in society. There were already some coming to Taizé at that time, and he must have sensed through them something changing in their mood. And he told the brothers, get ready to receive more young adults, because we need to be present, faced with what's coming. And then 2 years later, in 1968, there was an eruption in society. Much more than a simple conflict between generations. Brother Roger could have stopped there with a well-founded community engaged and recognised as having an ecumenical calling. But he couldn't stop. He would have had the right to stand there and be satisfied, but our rule says never stand still. It recalls the words of St. Paul, forgetting what lies behind, I run on ahead. In the rule, Brother Roger writes, never stand still, walk together with your brothers, run straight towards the goal, following the steps of Christ. And the steps of Christ give light ahead of us. To do this, we need to be fully committed in body and in mind, and that disturbs us sometimes because it shakes us out of our certainties. Brother Roger, he insisted that the brothers not stay in Taizé, but live outside of the community, sharing situations of distress. Small groups lived first of all in working class areas of cities in France, and then further afield on other continents. Brothers were sent to Eastern Europe to be with Christians who couldn't live their faith openly at that time and who couldn't visit other believers. There was no way that he wanted the brothers to become set in their ways. Second point, journeys to the east. One of the early brothers, Christoph, who has since passed away, he was a German prisoner of war in Russia during the Second World War. And he remembered seeing the Orthodox Church in the village near to the prison camp. After his release, he completed his studies and then became a brother in our community. And it was he who told Brother Roger that we should not forget the Christians in Eastern Europe. And in the early 60s, brothers and young people started to journey eastwards. Using tourist visas, they were able to visit Czechoslovakia, Poland and Hungary, to meet discreetly with Christians through mutual friends. And little by little, links built up. In 1972, the first brothers of the community visited the USSR by entering Finland and stopping in Leningrad, Novgorod, Moscow, Smolensk and Minsk, before leaving by Poland. And at the same time, friends of the community from Finland were able to visit Leningrad and the Baltic countries. In 1978, there's something gone wrong there. We need to go back. That's right. In 1978, Brother Roger visited Zagorsk, Moscow and Leningrad and was able to meet with Metropolitan And later that year, Brother Roger was present in Rome when the Metropolitan died. 20 years after his death, Brother Roger wrote to Patriarch Alexis II, 20 years ago, the beloved Metropolitan Nicodemus entered into the life of eternity. We met him first when he came to Taizé in December 1962. He blessed the icon of the Mother of God in our church. I saw him a year later during the celebrations of the 1,000 Years Foundation of Mount Athos. How could we forget his fine voice as he sang the praise of God in the Russian monastery? I went to see him for a few days in June 1978 in his diocese in Russia. He was ordaining new priests. He invited us for a meal and to meet the seminarians. Metropolitan Kirill, the actual patriarch, was the rector of the seminary. And today we remember him with young Russians present in Taizé. In 1988, Brother Roger spent 3 weeks in the USSR, invited for the celebrations of the 1,000 years of the baptism of the Rus. He visited Moscow, Kiev and Yaroslavl, and was also present at the local council of the Russian Orthodox Church in Trinity St. Sergius Lavra at Zagrozhsk. 5,000 Bibles in the synodal translation had been printed for the celebrations. Brother Roger told one of the bishops how in the past the community had sent 1 million New Testaments to Latin America at the request of the local church. The Russian bishop said they wouldn't be 1 million, but 20 million. On returning to Taizé, Brother Roger decided it would be possible to send 1 million copies of the New Testament in the synodal translation, printed in France to the Russian Orthodox Church. And it was still the time of the Soviet Union. The 9 lorry loads of New Testaments reached their destination in Moscow, Leningrad, Minsk and Kiev and were distributed. At the end of August 1989, Metropolitan Filaret of Minsk visited Taizé, and almost 1 year later, Metropolitan Kirill of Smolensk, you can see on the photo, future Patriarch Kirill I, who was the new President of the Department of External Church Relations of the Moscow Patriarchate, visited Taizé. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, young people came in ever larger numbers to take part in the youth meetings centered on the life of the community in Taizé. 3 times a day, all gather with the brothers in the Church of Reconciliation for prayer together. Every morning, a brother leads a Bible study. And then in the afternoon, sharing continues among the young people in small groups. Most of them stay in Taizé for 1 week. They're all from extremely different backgrounds, from geographical, cultural and church points of view. Yet during the week, something builds up. There's a spirit of trust and mutual understanding that grows. How is this possible? Perhaps 2 things can be said. Firstly, as a French bishop remarked during a visit to Taizé this summer, young people feel welcomed in Taizé because the brothers, coming from different origins, have learned to welcome one another by showing great respect towards the sensitivity of each one, acknowledging the different backgrounds. The trust that the brothers show each other in some way bears witness to others. In understanding, often intuitively, the life of the community, young people are able to seek paths of trust during their week in Taizé. Secondly, the meetings in Taizé are very Christ-centered. The Easter celebrations became central in the liturgical life of the community. Every weekend we celebrate the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. The community let itself be touched by the resurrection, knowing that times of failure or trial will not have the last word. The resurrection does not allow us to become closed in ourselves. The risen Christ doesn't only go ahead of us, he comes to us at the same time. He's already waiting for us, and he's already there on the path that we're trying to discover. And young people who come to Taizé experience this meeting with the risen Christ who goes before them. Not all will be able to express this in religious terminology, but there is an encounter for each one through prayer and meeting. When we look in the New Testament, then we see that Christ comes to meet the disciples even when they don't recognize him. You see it also in the Acts of the Apostles, at the most important moment, Christ is there on the path. Brother Roger had this profound awareness of the resurrection from the very beginnings. Even though he was a man who doubted, this faith in the resurrection never left him. If Christ is truly risen, then we cannot remain at a standstill. Nothing can hold us back. I remember in 1989, we didn't know where to hold our annual end-of-year European meeting of young adults. In March of that year, Brother Roger went to Rome for his yearly private audience with Pope John Paul II. And whilst he was there, the Polish Bishops' Conference was also there for their ad limina visits. And when Brother Roger came back to Taizé, he told us the next European meeting would be in Wrocław in Poland. It seemed crazy. Poland was still under a communist government. But the Cardinal of Wrocław invited him to the city for the European meeting. As the brothers set off in September of that year to begin the preparations, the events began that would lead to the falling of the Iron Curtain. And suddenly we found ourselves at that historic moment, able to welcome young people from every European country for the first time. Something had happened, something had been prepared that we hadn't realised. But Brother Rogers surely sensed something of what was coming. And in his conversations he saw a door that was opening, and once the door opened, he put his foot there. Earlier visits that had been made enabled a meeting that couldn't have been imagined before. In the early 90s, it brought an explosion in the numbers of young people visiting Taizé as the borders with Eastern Europe opened up. For the first time ever, youth from every corner of the continent were able to meet together. And brothers were able to visit them openly in their own countries. Pilgrimages to the Baltic states, to Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia became normal, so to speak. The links were already there, but it took time for us to understand the situation. And in those years, it was very important for us to go with empty hands, to try to listen, to understand the situation, not to go with some kind of fixed project, but like Brother Roger at the foundation of the community, to accept that we didn't know how things would continue. And at the same time, there was this profound conviction that we in the West had something to learn from the experience of believers in the former Soviet Union. It was not for us to give lessons or advice, to go along to an Orthodox liturgy, simply to take part and to greet the priest at the end without asking for anything in return. This sensitivity made us go very gently with the question of holding large youth gatherings in the post-Soviet space. It was only in 2009 that a first such meeting took place in Vilnius in Lithuania, the invitation of Cardinal Baptist. And what was very striking was to discover that reconciliation is possible, that despite the vagaries of history, young people from countries so close and yet often quite distant gathered to share what really matters. There were 30 ghost parishes and hundreds of families in Vilnius and the surrounding region offered hospitality hospitality to young people from all the neighbouring countries, and also from several countries further away. What a sign of peace in the human family it was to hear in the prayers, readings following one another in Lithuanian, in Polish, in Belarusian, in Latvian. And in the course of the afternoon, young participants and the townspeople gathered in various locations for workshops on very diverse topics. In the cathedral, they were invited to reflect on God's call. In the Lutheran Church, on the role of singing in faith. In a museum dedicated to the memory of the Soviet regime, on the weight of the past in contemporary society. At the Orthodox Cathedral, on the icons and examples of liturgical chant in Greece, Georgia and Russia. In a theatre, on various folk traditions, including Jewish. In the streets they could meet the disadvantaged with volunteers from Caritas. There's contact with the Faith and Light community, and also welcomed a group from Moscow. No, stop that. Go back. Come back. Yeah, I jumped. How do we do that? Got lost. In 2011, 250 young people, mainly from Western Europe, of Catholic and Protestant background, came on pilgrimage to Moscow to take part in the Holy Week and Easter celebrations of the initiative of Taizé with the blessing of Metropolitan Hilarion Alfieyev. All the participants stayed with Orthodox families from 6 city centre churches. After this pilgrimage, one young person wrote, "The welcome was lovely, even though we couldn't speak to each other. On the welcome day, it was made understood that I can feel at home here. I was offered tea and Russian sweets. Very lovely. Being able to immerse into the Orthodox traditions was very interesting for me. I could broaden my understanding of theological ways to understand the happening of the cross, but was also very touched in my heart. For me, coming from a Lutheran church, I find the rituals, the music, the candles, the incense, all the ceremony very beautiful, as we have not got all this in my own denomination. It was a very enriching experience, and somehow I also felt as if I was going back to my own roots church-wise. This year in September, at the invitation of the Catholic and Lutheran Archbishops in Riga, Latvia, a second Baltic regional meeting was held. Given the political circumstances, gathering young people from the Baltic states, Ukraine, Belarus and Russia, took on a special significance. One of the participants wrote, "In our region we have lots of hard feelings due to the complicated history of relations and even to some ongoing conflicts. So I went to the meeting in Riga hoping for a miracle of just being together before the Lord, not judging but praying together and for each other. And I'm thankful to the organisers of the meeting for not pretending that these issues are not important, but speaking of them always with great tact and care. And besides, in the context of the situation in the region, singing together in Russian at a meeting in Riga, despite those difficulties, was a sign of real hope for me." I was going to speak about Rome 2012, but I won't. But I will finish just by saying, on the morning of November the 30th, Alexei already spoke about this meeting between Pope Francis and the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew in Constantinople on St. Andrew's Day. And Pope Francis, he said some words which touched us very much. He spoke about the search for full communion between the churches, and he cited 3 voices, calling especially for unity. He spoke about the poor, he spoke about the victims of conflict, and he spoke about youth. And speaking about youth, he added, it's precisely the young who today implore us to make progress towards full communion. I think of, for example, of the many Orthodox, Catholic and Protestant youth who come together in meetings organised by the Taizé community. They do this not because they ignore the differences which still separate us, but because they're able to see beyond them. They're able to embrace what is essential and what already unites us. And I think for us in Taizé, that's very important. Young people sense what already unites us, and they lead us forward.
Beautiful lesson in being on the way, spiritual community, and not claiming the truth, but being uncertain, intact, listening to each other, and sensitivities to Thank you very much for this beautiful lesson in being on the way, intact and sensitivities to the essentials, and not claiming the truth, but knowing that we are in dynamics. I think that this is maybe the medicine against fundamentalism. And I think also that for academic theology, it might be also a lesson, not being arrogant and not claiming your standpoint. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. There certainly would be questions. So please don't hesitate to ask. I see I'm wanting to ask. So please do.
Can I? Thank you very much. I think it's a very inspiring example that in Taizé, though the initial aim was not to bring different Christians together, it actually happened. I'm very curious on how the Taizé community feels about other religious traditions.
You mean other religions? Other religions, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that we see first of all our life as being a sign of reconciliation among Christians, and that's the standpoint for us, I think. Yeah. But at the same time, for Brother Roger, the goal of Christians, it was never a goal in itself. To show this unity among Christians is to make the gospel believable, to become a ferment, like the yeast in society, so that others can believe in God's love. He often used to say, Christ didn't come to create a religion, but came to help everyone understand that they're loved by God. We have brothers who live in Bangladesh, and I spent some months there with them some years ago. And of course in Bangladesh it's a majority Muslim population. At the time of the first Gulf War there were threats against Christians. Our brothers have been there for 30 years, they have a good contact with local Muslims. And the Muslims, friends, they came to the brothers and said, if you have problems, tell us. We'll hide you in our villages because you are good Muslims. You pray and you help the poor. There's already some of the pillars of Islam. And that was very, very touching because they used their own language to say that they recognized something authentic in what the brothers were living. There was a testimony there. I don't know if that's answered in some way. think we have to be careful in Taizé against the kind of relativism. It happens now among young people that we say all religions are the same. And I think it's so important that as Christians, often in the West, we have a slightly guilty conscience about being Christian. We want to make space for the other religions, but we must never be ashamed of our faith. As Christians, it's our faith that the full revelation of God is in Christ. We can't escape that. But that doesn't stop respect and dialogue with